Getting it real with RealChunWai on the hottest topics, frank, engaging and candid. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. She has created history as the first State Assembly representative of Puteri Muda. Fresh from the just concluded Johor state elections, let's hear it from YB Amira Aisya. Good evening, Malaysia and followers from around the world. Tonight is an exciting night, and it is a great honor and privilege to have our guest, YB Amira Aisya. Wow.
Hello, thank you so much for having me here. Still getting used to the YB part.
All right. Let me just give a brief introduction. We all know her, but for those of you in other parts of the world who are watching this, let me just give a brief description. She is the newly elected State Assembly representative for Puteri Wangsa. She is a co-founder and the Secretary General of Puteri Muda. She is a law graduate from the International Islamic University. Please welcome YB Amira.
Thank you so much.
We will start this conversation by congratulating you, and we are really pleased to have you as our guest. Perhaps you can tell us how does it feel now to be called YB?
Well, I think number one, I'm still not used to being called YB. So sometimes when people call me YB without my name, I didn't answer. I'm sorry. Not because I'm arrogant, but I'm still getting used to it. But I always believe that YB actually stands for Yang Berkhidmat. And so it's time for me to really be a part of that name to serve the people well. When I win when the news of me winning the seat of Puteri Wangsa, obviously I'm very, very happy and very, very touched because it's not just my work alone. It's the work of a whole team behind me, with me. And this is a team that has worked tirelessly day and night to ensure that the mandate is given to Puteri Muda to take care of Puteri Wangsa. And I take this as a very huge responsibility. I don't want to just be another elected representative who comes and go. I want to be someone who will be able to serve the people as best as possible. And I take this as a very huge responsibility for me to carry.
Mm-hmm. When you recall back the election campaign, what were the highlights and what have you learned from that campaigning period?
I think, well, the campaign itself is a very special campaign, not just for me, but for Muda as a whole, because it's not just my first time campaigning, but it's also Puteri Muda's first election campaign ever, because we've just been officially registered December last year, 23rd December. And so the Johor state election is our first stint officially in the political landscape of Malaysia. And so looking back at it, I think it's very, it's very interesting because we can finally really feel being a part of that democracy process, not just being in the behind the scene work, but now we are at the front line of that particular democracy process. And I think a lot of us learn a lot of new things, explore new ways that might resonate better with the younger generations, especially because in the recent state election, it's the first time that the Undi 18 generation is able to vote. And so we are exploring many ways to ensure that we'll be able to reach different demographic of voters, as well as in order to ensure that we can have that good match of traditional plus the new way of campaigning. I think it's very interesting for us to explore that. For me, particularly, I think what I've learned the most is, number one, for a party that is very new, where I think admittedly we don't have machinery as huge as the traditional parties that have existed long before us, nor do we have the funding that many parties have. To me, what I learned is, number one, is you have to pick a candidate that is very suitable for the place where you are contesting, especially it's a state seat. Because if it's a
Yeah.
parliamentary seat, then the attachment to the particular local issues is not as much as if it's a state legislative seat. And so I'm very lucky to be placed in Puteri Wangsa because this is where my home is at. My family is in Puteri Wangsa. And so, when you know the local issues, you know the local areas, it made it so much better and so much easier for you to engage with the people in order for you to speak the same language as them, to speak about issues that resonate well with them. In terms of machinery, when Parti Muda being the youngest, I think youngest party, in this whole election campaign, what I really see is that the strength of volunteers is impeccable. So in my campaign in Puteri Wangsa, I have I started off with just a 5-man team, 4 friends who believe in the cause, but then it started to grow when people start to believe in your cause and people start to see what you really want to give back to the people. It started with a 5-man team and it grew until there's like 200 over volunteers who came out and helped. And what's really interesting is to have really, really young volunteers, at the age of 15 years old, 16 years old, coming out to help with the election campaign. And
amazing.
They have the blessing of their parents to be at the campaign. And, I think when you have a very strong volunteer group, and I think that itself will help boost your campaign a lot more.
Amira, much has been said about the disunity among the opposition parties, and despite the opposition getting the more popular votes than the Barisan Nasional, and they did better, why do you think that this has been the result, this disunity? There's so many parties were contesting against each other.
Well, I think initially when I was looking at the the number of parties that is campaigning, number one for me, it doesn't necessarily signal a wrong thing for the democracy process in Malaysia. I believe that when you have more parties in Malaysia, it only means that a lot more people want to be involved in the democracy process. And so it can mean both ways. It can, one thing, it's, it can be confusing for the people because they are not used to it. But number two, it also means that democracy is very much alive in Malaysia in sense that, for example, Parti Muda itself, it was established because the young people believe that it's time for us to enter the process. And I think that's a healthy thing. It doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. But when we're looking at the state election, honestly, it's a bit confusing. Because when you look at it, most people would think that there's Barisan Nasional as the government bloc, and then the rest of them is in the opposition bloc. I had this interview, and I will remain, I mean, that question remains until today. For me, when you're talking about coalition like Perikatan Nasional, for example, my question back is, are they in the government bloc or are they in the opposition bloc? It's tough for us to actually sort of compartmentalize them in a certain bloc, especially in the Johor state election. But I think it says a lot about our electoral system as well. When the popular votes don't actually go to Barisan Nasional, but because we have the first past the post system, and so it means that regardless of the fact that the popularity doesn't go to Barisan Nasional, they win it because of that particular system. I think when I'm looking at what is going on in the state election, moving forward, you can't only be thinking about how do we fix things for G15, because that's a short-term solution. What we have to think about is how do we fix the system so that it becomes a good system for future generations to come. And when I look at it, it's not only about, obviously, there's a lot of talk about the greater opposition to sit together and to go back to the drawing block together to ensure that we can win G15. True, that's a sort of like a short-term thing that we have to look at. But in the longer run, there's a real emergency need, a real urgent need for us to look at our electoral system and to do electoral reforms to ensure that the voice of the people will be, properly being heard, and that the people's popular vote will become the government of the day.
If I may just add, if you look at the British system itself, although it has the first past the post, like in Malaysia, not many people are aware because the media concentrate entirely on the Conservatives versus the Labour Party. But actually, a lot of other parties are in the run. That's why you have all these loony candidates. They call it the loony left. You know, the socialists. They have actually there may be 10 people contesting, but the media just concentrate on the serious contenders. It's the same, I think, with the US. The media just concentrate on the Republicans and the Democrats, but they're actually third or fourth party that's contesting. In Singapore, they have also made some adjustment to the first past the post system by including the minorities and gender to be part of this whole process to make sure that no minorities are left out in the race. So I mean, going forward, given the circumstances we are in, I'm sure at some point we will have to relook at how we can improve the system. But coming to the more important, you can have all the system, but if there's no voters turning up, then it's meaningless. In this Johor election, we knew that it was going to come down, the numbers. We know that many people will not be coming back to vote. So there's been a lot of discussion over this. But having said that, why was it that all the parties were not able to convince voters to come out to vote? We're talking about 1/1,000,000 people who are registered voters. They're staying in Johor. They're not anywhere but in the state, and yet they refuse to come out to vote. Why was it that all the parties could not convince them to say, hey, come out to vote? Why?
I think, again, when we're looking at the voter turnout, there's a lot of factor influencing the voter turnout itself. Number one, obviously, we can look at the parties themselves, whether or not the parties are able to inspire people to go out to vote. But that's one factor, in comparison with so many other factors that we have to look at. I think this part is very important, and not many people talked about it. Political fatigue doesn't only come because people don't believe in political parties. Political fatigue also come because, for example, you have too many elections, one after another. It's the same way as anything else. For example, if you are, for example, let's say that you in doing a crowdfunding system, for example, because I run a lot of crowdfunding stuff. And when we look at crowdfunding itself, if you do one thing right after another, and you do one thing right after another, people have that donors fatigue as well. There has to be some sort of excitement leading up to a certain election, but we have too many elections back to back that make people feel like, oh, I'm too tired to go out for another election. And although it's state election, which is we're selecting the state legislative assemblyman, and we're not picking picking member of parliament, but most people don't understand that, because there's not enough message going to the ground by mainstream media, by the election commission, to educate the people that the state legislative assembly is not the same as picking members of parliament. So when I go down on the ground, a lot of them felt that, oh, no need lah, go this one, next year we have to vote again. So I have to make them understand that, no, if you vote for for this particular state legislative assembly, it will remain for the next 5 years to come. And then only then they were like, oh, 5 years now, that's a long time. And then we'll, and that will make them understand better. That's number one. Number two, again, I think it goes back to our electoral reforms once again. There's a lot of things that I think should really be looked into. For example, in the time of COVID-19, in this time of pandemic, I think it's high time that we really look into our election system of, because we need to convince the people to go vote. But if they don't want to go out and vote because they are worried about the, pandemic, because they are worried about the COVID-19, then you have to think of how can we still get them involved in this democracy process, because no one should be left behind because they are scared of COVID-19. At the same time, it's the same way as when we're talking about the postal vote, for example. Why is postal vote only available for those who are living overseas? Why can't we also allow it for those who are living out of state, for example? Those who live in Sabah and Sarawak may have to pay more to go back in comparison to those who live in Singapore. But those who live in Singapore can go use postal vote, but those who live in Sabah and Sarawak cannot. And I think that's also something that we have to look into. On top of that, things, for example, let's say, for those who are, because the election happens on Saturday. Yes, it's on Saturday. But a lot of those who work in the private sectors, for example, there are those who have to work on Saturdays as well. And if they want to go out and vote, they have to take unpaid leave. And this, in my constituent, for example, I met at least 5 people who said that I want to go out and vote, but my concern is that my boss do not allow me to take paid leave. I have to take unpaid leave. So I asked them, can you take half day off? And they said, no, my boss doesn't allow a half day off. And they asked us to settle it there and then. But it's quite tough for us to settle those kind of things. So there's a need for us to really look into our electoral system that I think have not gone through any reform for such a long time. It's quite, I think when you're talking about any sort of system whatsoever, you have to look into it. Every 5 to 10 years, you have to look into it and see whether there's a need for you to reform the system, or whether there's a need for you to change several things. But our electoral system has not been changed for such a long time.
One way would be, of course, to declare on voting day that it must be a public holiday. So that's one way out.
That's another thing. But again, of course, I do not deny that a lot of work needs to be done by political parties to reach out to the people and to return back the hope to the people that your vote will not be wasted.
Amira, a lot has been talked about the 700,000 young voters. Has there been available statistics to show how the young voters, how did they vote? Are they readily available now?
Well, I'm not sure about other places, but for MUDA itself, we're still crunching the data. We're also commissioning experts to help us crunch the data that we have. But I think number one is in terms of their leaning towards which party are they voting. That's something that we will leave to the experts to sort of analyze the data and see what's the result. But I think what's very interesting in this election, because this is my first time running an election, but I have been involved in a campaign in GE14. But the significant difference that I see in this particular campaign is the amount of the younger generations who come out to be a part of the core team of the campaign. For example, like I mentioned, in my team itself, I have people as young as 16 years old running a team of their own. That's very inspirational in sense when you're talking about the Undi 18, don't look at it in a microscopical view of only voting. But in their participation in politics itself, you can see that there's a huge significant improvement in comparison with the last elections.
Do you think that in this Johor election, there has been reports that one of the reasons why Barisan Nasional did much better was because that they had this common theme on a better future, better stability, and that they were talking about bread and butter issues, while many of the opposition parties were still harping on one MDB, Najib, corruption. Do you think that it did not went down well because these issues sort of were detached from the ordinary Johorians who are struggling to make a living? They're trying to keep their jobs, trying to pay the bills. Do you agree with the assessment?
I think because when we're looking at issues, it differs from one place to another. Issues like corruption can resonate better with people of in the urban side of urban side voters. But voters who stay in a rural, more rural side of the state, or in the semi-urban side, corruption issues might not be their utmost importance. Not to say that they don't care about it. I think the awareness is much better now than, say, 10 years ago, for example. But I also don't think it's true that oppositions are only talking about that. I think, and this is something that the message might get, might be lost in translation in terms of in media, for example. But overall, when I look at the opposition's campaign, for example, because it's not just looking at MUDA, also looking at our friends from Pakatan Harapan as well, They're also talking about bread and butter issue. For example, economical values. And Pakatan Harapan plus MUDA is the first one who spoke about the reopening of border of Singapore and Johor. And it very much involves, bread and butter issue for the Johorians at large. We speak a lot about social welfare. We speak a lot about affordable housing. We speak a lot about education. And at the end of the day, obviously, all this we tie back to how if there's corruption, it's tough for you to change the system. But that doesn't mean we don't touch on bread and butter issue. But again, I must admit that if we look at the media, it does seem as if these messages have been lost. But I went to several campaigns, not just mine, because I was also invited to speak at, for example, at Pulau Sebatang. I was invited to speak at Kota Iskandar, at Skudai, sorry, not at Skudai, at Johor Jaya, and several other places. And in all those places, they did talk about bread and butter issue. And so, for example, sorry, I was trading off. So to answer your question, I think it is right as a whole to say that the people do care a lot about bread and butter issue. But I also feel that it's our responsibility to also keep on educating the people about corruption issue, because the people are getting more and more aware about it. But at the same time, there's a need for them to better understand why when there's corruption in the system, it's tougher for us to change other things. It's very much intertwined with one another. Yeah.
Since we are talking about corruption, we're talking about 1MDB. How much of an influence did Najib actually play? Depending on who you speak to, of course, the UMNO has said that he played a big role. Others said, no, not so sure about it. But in your view, did he actually play a role? Did he contribute anything to the win of the Barisan Nasional?
Well, again, like you mentioned, it really depends on who we are talking to. For example, when I talk to the people of Puteri Wangsa, for example, they are more fueled to go out to vote when they see that Najib Razak came down and campaigned. Not to vote for Barisan Nasional, but they want to go out and vote to ensure that Najib Razak will not retain his power. And so I feel that he still plays, whether we like it or not, he still plays a huge role in influencing the voters.
I see.
But it can go both ways, I suppose.
Yeah.
On those who have always been supportive of opposition bloc, will definitely, they are definitely fueled. Their anger is very much fueled by him being able to go out and campaign, and that sort of gave them the push to go out to vote and actually ensure that he's out of the picture altogether. But at the same time, obviously in that he has his stronghold of supporters at the same time. But I came from a family that most of my extended family members have always been supporters of UMNO Barisan Nasional. I'm very frank about it. But when they saw that Najib Razak came out to campaign, some of them actually decided to not go out and vote at all. Because they do not want to give the vote to other parties, but they also don't want to give the vote to Barisan Nasional. So I believe that it can go both ways in terms of his presence during the campaign.
From the media assessment, even among some of my friends, when they first started some years back, they were very angry with 1MDB. They were very angry with Najib. Of course, fast forward into this year, past 2 years, they seem to have mellowed down. Perhaps they have grown fatigue. They have given up the sense of hopelessness. But the anger towards Najib have softened. Of course, there are those who say that, look, the federal court process is taking too long. He should be in jail by now. But there's also a large segment of Malaysians who says that, look, we long for his leadership. I mean, he's corrupt. He has taken a lot of money. But during his time, he seems to have provided a better sense of earning, or rather a better way for Malaysians to earn their living compared to now. It is much tougher. Do you hear that kind of talk on the ground when you were campaigning?
Well, I would say that luckily the people that I met at my kawasan don't feel that way, at least during my campaign time.
Yeah.
But I can admit that outside of campaign time, before
Okay.
the Johor election, I have met not many people. I've met one
Sure.
person who have said that that's the mother of a friend of mine, my friend's
Okay.
mother, felt that way. But that is the reason why it's very important for us to keep the conversation going. I understand how it can be very tiring for the people, but people also need to understand uh,
Yeah.
why does this happen in the first place? What's
Yeah.
the reason that our the system is so much corrupt and so much difficult for us to fix? The people have to understand how much 1MDB is impacting our lives.
Yes.
They have to understand all this. And even if it gets tiring in terms of communicating this to the people, I think we have to continue. And I believe that that's where the younger generations you play a huge role as well. Back then, it's more of the parents
Yeah.
influencing the children. But the trend right now, I see that if we manage to influence the young minds and let them be able to understand better on certain issues, they'll then be able to influence their parents. And I think that's another thing that we really have to look into to ensure that the younger generations really understand this knowledge, but don't just understand it for themselves, but also speak about this to their family members as well.
MUDA contested in 7 areas. You won one. Have you carried out an assessment as to why you lost in the 6 seats?
Again, I think in terms of the statistical part of it,
Sure.
we are crunching the data still.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I do believe that it's a great start for MUDA. Again, we've just been registered last year, December. In comparison with other parties, obviously we don't have machinery as huge as, I mean, if we are to compare with Perikatan Nasional or Barisan Nasional itself, obviously we are far behind. But in places like Bukit Permai, in places like Tenang, we are able to defeat Perikatan Nasional. We finished second. And I think that's a huge thing for a newly for a startup party. And in other seats as well, we have all of the seats. We did not lose our deposit. I think that's a huge thing to say, and that's I think it's a good signal as a start for MUDA. Obviously, there's a lot for us to learn, and I think there's a lot that we can improve on based on the statistics that we will receive later on. But I think one thing that we managed to debunk is that this idea that racial sentiment still plays a huge role.
Okay.
For example, in place like Puteri Wangsa, where the majority of the voters are Chinese, and many of the parties that contest in Puteri Wangsa put up Chinese candidate. But I, as a Malay, am able to convince the voters to vote for MUDA. Lim Wejek, for example, is placed in Penang, a very rural area where there's a lot of felda in there. And the majority of the voters are Malay. Yes, he didn't win, but he finished second, did much better than Perikatan Nasional, did way better than Pejuang. In Machak as well, Sanggaran is placed in a place where there's only 5% Indian voters. But again, he also did not lose deposit, which means that he managed to get a lot of the voters to believe in him as well. So I think looking at what we have done in this election is that in a way we have shown that Malaysians are ready to move away from racial sentiments, not anything else.
I think that's really, really important. Do you think that this time in this Johor state election, because of the racial composition, where while the Malays make up 51%, but it's actually a state which is urban, mostly urban, and that the voters of the non-Malays were actually very important and crucial. Do you feel that in this particular election, there were really not much racial or religious issues being used because of these factors? And of course, for me as an outsider from Johor, I felt that this is really good because if we could go forward with this kind of trend, absence of these divisive issues, and you have to the beginning of it, as you mentioned, of people from different races contesting in areas which may be predominantly a certain race, but non-racial candidates could come in. Do you feel that this happened in Johor?
Yeah, I think in places, for example, before this, even in Johor itself, before this, you see a lot of racial sentiments being thrown around. Things like, Malays have to vote in a Malay, for example. And things like this have been played around for too long. In fact, even for Pilihan Raya Kecil Tanjung Piai, it's being played. And so the thing is, it's not just about the composition of Johor itself, but you can see the progress of voters as a whole, because the political parties and what the voters feel is very much like a chicken and egg issue. What the political parties play out will be the things that the voters consume. At the same time, what the voters are demanding will be what the political parties are supplying.
Correct.
I think when you look at it as a whole, it means that the political parties are very much now aware that the people are moving away from those sentiments, and so they're not supplying those kind of things anymore. At the same time, if we can keep this momentum going, which means the political parties stop paying these sentiments, then we can stop the people from consuming these kind of things, and it can make our, we grow better as a nation. Yeah.
Also, that now we have social media, so politicians cannot be singing different tunes in different areas. So that which is really good. I just want to ask about that in this election in Johor. Amanah had the support of many DAP and Amanah speakers who spoke in this ceramahs. But of course, going forward in a general election, where everybody is taking care of themselves in their own kawasan, they got battles to fight. More and more, their MUDA will be on their own. So if a general election is called, let's just say by August or September, and you have perhaps a very short period to prepare for yourself, because this time everyone will be for yourself. How would you prepare yourself now for the GE, for example?
I think, again, because we have just been registered, obviously we have been activated for the past 2 years, but this activation has not been official, and this activation has not been moving towards, let's say, the idea of winning election per se. But with the number of membership that we have, about 75,000 members as a whole, it's very important for us right now to activate all our members to be involved in the democracy process as much as they are involved during, for example, our flag mission. We can see, for example, during our flag mission, although being at that point of time not even a registered party, we are able to mobilize our members in all the places where it's affected by the flood, and we mobilize them in such a huge way that at the same time we're able to not just cover those places, but we're able to also inspire more volunteers to be on board with us. And if we are able to do that for the flood mission, I think the same strategy should be used moving towards GE15 to ensure that all our members are activated to be involved in the electoral process. Moving forward, it's important for us to activate all states, because right now we haven't officially activated all states yet. To activate all states and to ensure that we have representative in all parliaments. Because MUDA is a new party. Most parties start to grow like cabang and ranting. But in MUDA's constitution itself, we have the state level, we have the federal level, and then we have state level, and then we only have the parliamentary level. So now we need to activate those parliamentary levels, and to ensure that, I think the most important thing is to allow the people to recognize MUDA, the logo MUDA itself. I think that is one thing that we really have to do, and do quick, starting from yesterday.
Both you and Said Sidek comes from Johor. So like it or not, it will be seen like, oh, okay, MUDA is a very Johor centric, perhaps Klang Valley centric a bit. How has MUDA be able to extend itself in the other states after Klang Valley, after Johor? What will be the subsequent important states, priority states for MUDA?
Well, actually, this before we are even registered, the
Mhm.
state that is most active in MUDA is not Johor, not Selangor or Wilayah. The state that is most active in MUDA is actually Sabah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and so I think, for example, under the leadership of Sharizal Denchi, who
Mhm.
is a modern farmer, and Amos Tian, who is a businessman, they ran quite an impressive machinery over there in Sabah
Okay.
for MUDA. On top of that, states like Pahang is also growing rapidly. We can see during the flight mission, they managed to mobilize their people very well, very organized manner. And
Mhm.
so to say that MUDA is only
Mhm.
tied to the Klang Valley and Johor is actually false, because
Okay.
we have very impressive leadership elsewhere as well. But again,
Mhm.
I do admit that in several other states, there's a need for us to move
Yeah.
more vigorously, because general election is not just one or two states, right? Because it's
Yeah.
all the states. But I think we have a good start. We just need to push harder.
Mhm. As with all political parties, there's also this question of real politics. Obviously, that now you have some help from the fellow opposition parties because they need MUDA to come in as well to help them take on in Johor. As MUDA goes stronger, some fellow parties may see MUDA as a competition. How does MUDA intend to navigate through the situation? Of course, it is still very early days. You may not have that problem now, but eventually it would happen. It's not hypothetical, but as in many cases, if you look at Johor as an example, that all the parties competed among themselves, that would come. So how do you navigate this situation and look, while MUDA is growing, you also do not want to make the others feel jittery about it?
Yeah. Well, I think from the very beginning, MUDA has always been consistent in our call for a united opposition. I think we have been the most consistent from the start. Um, we've called for united opposition, not just amongst Pakatan Harapan, but even with our friends in Pejuang, even with our friends in Warisan, because we believe that as long as we have the same principle, as long as we carry the same values, we reject corruption, we reject the politics of power and politics of money, we should be working together for a better Malaysia. And it's important, and I think in terms of how to navigate that better, is one thing that we should have is better communication amongst the party. And I cannot stress about this
Yeah.
harder, because I believe that whatever mistake that has happened is due to miscommunication. And if we have better communication and we can tolerate better with one another, and figure out a way for us to move together forward as a team rather than trying to sabotage one another, I think that's very important. And when we can communicate that well, when we can have that constant communication with our friends, then it's us assuring them, at the same time we also are assured by their sincerity. I think that's very important. Um, and that's the reason why from the very beginning I've mentioned that there's a need for the greater opposition to sit together and go at the drawing block together, to strategize together, because from the very start you have to be able to work together, and it cannot be just just a 5-10 minutes conversation and you call it a
Mhm.
day, right? Because you want to um, enter GE15 with the intention to win, and you don't just want to enter GE15 just because you want to contest. And so in wanting to win, you have to show to the people that you are a government in waiting, and a government in waiting has to be able to communicate with one another. And if you can't do that, it's tough for you to show to the people that we are ready to govern, and the people will just sort of lose their interest to look at the
Okay.
opposition blocks together. Yeah.
My view as a political watcher is that a united opposition coalition or a team and the communication that you spoke about will be much easier and much more effective if the various older opposition parties are led by newer and fresher political leaders of these parties. Okay. Okay, one final question before we let you off. What kind of political culture do you like to bring as a YB?
Yeah. Political culture. I think number one, MUDA has always believed in three things, and actually four things: politics of service, politics of policy, politics of value, and politics of fighting against what's wrong. And this is the core value that we've always been talking about. Now, in terms of politics of service, I think from the very beginning, we've sort of have a good track record about that. For example, during the flood mission, during the white flag mission, during at the time when students are stuck in university, MUDA has managed to show up in those kind of situations. But above and beyond, when now that I'm an elected representative, it's important for me to show that I'm serious in terms of going down to the ground, meeting my people, understanding what kind of problems they have, and ensuring that as an elected representative, I can, sort of serve them in sense that bringing their voice to the day one, and at the same time connecting them with, the bodies that are responsible in taking care of those issues. That's number one. In terms of political values, for example, it's important for us to start taking the narrative away from politics is all about power and money. And that can only happen when we do it, leading it by example. For example, in MUDA itself, even for the state election, we've always advocated for political funding act, but just because it's not in place doesn't mean that we can't do it first. And so in the Johor state election, MUDA has set quite a high SOP for ourselves that then we sort of like, sometimes we felt like, should we not have done it? But no matter how difficult it is, it has to be done, in sense that we want to ensure that there's transparency as to how much is going into our account, how much is going out from the account, and there's a funding cap to ensure that we are not controlled by one or two tycoons, because I think the people need to know that we belong to the people and not just to one or two people who are, who can sponsor us as a fool. And this is the kind of culture that we need to start from now, even without that act in place. We have to create it, and then so that it is entrenched in all MUDA members, so that even without an act, they know that this is the right way of doing things. Then that's the value that we want to bring. And politics of policy, we want to move politics away from vengeance, from attacking, from personal attacks, which have been going on for so long. I myself have been, although I'm still new in politics, but in my very short stint of politics, I have received so many personal attacks, publicly and also privately, especially as a woman in politics. You received a lot of that. We have to move away from that. If you want to fight against your opposition party, you fight them on policy. Fight them about the things that they want to bring to the table, rather than fighting about their personal lives, rather than fighting about how they look like and their age or their gender. It's important for us to inspire younger generations, inspire more people to be involved in politics. And speaking about politics of vengeance is not the way for you to inspire the young.
Correct. I hope that you will not have 4 bodyguards in sunglasses or an entourage with 20 people following you, and of course immediately order a Velfire.
Yeah.
It seems to be the standard projection of a Malaysian politician.
Yeah, I want to have a Velfire kitchen, so that's the only Velfire that I will have.
So thank you, YB. Congratulations again. We hope to have you back again as our guest to share with us. Malaysians, followers around the world, please follow YB and myself on social media. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you so much. Good night, sir. Thank you.